My parents favored my sister, but when I inherited $10 million, they demanded $1 million. So I sued them. My family looked perfect from the outside. My parents, my older sister Emily, and I seemed like a picture-perfect suburban unit, a neatly trimmed lawn, smiles at school functions, and a house that echoed with life. But beneath the surface, our home was anything but harmonious. To anyone looking in, Emily was the crown jewel of our family, the golden child. She was everything my parents could have dreamed of, a straight-A student, beautiful, polite, and naturally talented at everything she touched. To them, she was proof of their success as parents. And then there was me, Mike, the unwanted one, the mistake. That word haunted me from the earliest years I could remember. My parents, Karen and Robert, didn't just fail to hide their disdain for me. They went out of their way to make sure I knew it. I wasn't merely overlooked or neglected. I was actively resented. It was a slow realization at first, something I felt in the air rather than understood. But by the time I was old enough to interpret their words and actions, the message was clear. I wasn't supposed to exist. Karen had a sharp tongue, and her critiques of me came fast and often. Whether it was spilling a drink at the dinner table or struggling with a math problem, she'd let me know how much of a disappointment I was. Robert, on the other hand, rarely spoke directly to me unless he was angry. His silence was almost worse than her words, his apathy a constant reminder that I wasn't worth his time. Together, they created a household where Emily could do no wrong and I could do no right. I remember one particular day when I was 6. We had been tasked in school to draw a picture of our families, and I was proud of what I had created. It was a simple stick figure drawing, but to me, it represented something I hoped for, a family that smiled together, united. I couldn't wait to show my mom. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that she might smile and put it on the fridge like the other kids' parents did with their artwork. Instead, she crumpled the paper in her hand, tossed it in the trash, and walked away. I stood there, tears welling in my eyes, as she casually remarked how much better Emily could draw. That moment carved a deep wound in me, one of many to come. Emily was the center of their universe, and she knew it. She basked in the glow of their approval and learned quickly how to use it to her advantage. She wasn't just the golden child, she was a master manipulator. If she broke something, she'd point the finger at me, and my parents would believe her without hesitation. Once, when we were playing in the backyard, she pushed me off the swing. I landed hard, my head striking a jagged rock. Blood trickled down my forehead, and my cries echoed through the yard. But when my mom came running out, Emily spun a tale about how I had been trying to kick her, and she had only pushed me in self-defense. I was punished while Emily was comforted. The scar from that incident is still visible today, a physical reminder of my role as the scapegoat. At school, the torment continued. Kids seemed to sense my vulnerability, as if they could see the target painted on my back. I was the outsider, the easy pickings for bullies looking to assert dominance. Jason, a particularly cruel classmate, led the charge. During one recess, he and a group of kids cornered me behind the school. What started as verbal taunts escalated into shoves, then punches. Jason grabbed a fistful of dirt and ground it into my face, laughing as his friends joined in. I was left on the ground, bruised and humiliated, my clothes torn. When I mustered the courage to tell a teacher, Mrs. Johnson, she dismissed me with a look of annoyance. She told me that if I wasn't such a troublemaker, these things wouldn't happen. Her words stung almost as much as the kicks I had endured. Home offered no solace from these experiences. On the rare occasion I tried to tell my parents about the bullying, they brushed it off as me being too sensitive. My mom would scoff, while my dad, if he bothered to look up from his beer, would grunt in disapproval. I stopped trying to seek comfort, knowing it wasn't there to be found. I began to internalize the idea that the problem wasn't them, it was me. Maybe I really was the troublemaker, the screw-up, the mistake. When I turned 10, the darkness at home deepened. My father's drinking, always a constant undercurrent, became a daily fixture. He'd come home already half-drunk, his mood unpredictable and dangerous. Nights became a game of survival, trying to gauge whether he'd collapse in his chair in front of the TV or unleash his simmering rage on me. One night, he stormed into my room while I was doing homework. The sight of him froze me in place. He grabbed me roughly by the arm, dragging me down the hallway to the kitchen, where my mother sat chain-smoking at the table. Without warning, he slapped me across the face, his voice dripping with disdain as he hurled insults I barely understood at the time. My mom didn't even look up from her cigarette. Physical pain, I learned, faded quickly. It was the emotional weight of these moments that lingered. I felt invisible in my own home, a ghost haunting the periphery of my family's life. My only escape was the thought of running away, but even that seemed futile. Where would I go? Who would care? The realization that there was nowhere for me to turn was a heavy burden for a child to bear. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had become a shell of myself. The bright-eyed boy who once hoped to make his parents proud was gone, replaced by someone who expected rejection and braced for disappointment. Life had taught me to expect cruelty, and I carried those lessons with me wherever I went. The night my father hit me with such force that I fell to the floor wasn't the first time he'd laid his hands on me, but it was the first time it felt like a deliberate act of cruelty. This wasn't a slap intended to correct my behavior or instill fear. It was a full-on strike, meant to cause pain and humiliate me. As I lay curled up on the cold kitchen floor, his words rained down like blows of their own. He hurled insults, calling me a failure, telling me I'd never amount to anything, and blaming me for every ounce of misery in his life. I tried to block out his voice, but the venom behind his words seeped into every corner of my mind. My mother sat nearby, a cigarette balanced between her fingers, watching with disinterest. She didn't intervene, didn't tell him to stop. It was as though my pain wasn't worth acknowledging. After that night, the abuse became routine. My father seemed to find a grim satisfaction in using me as his punching bag, whether he was drunk or not. His hits were quick to follow any perceived slight, a misplaced word, a forgotten chore, or even just the look on my face. Each blow left a mark, not just on my body, but on my psyche. My mother's indifference only amplified the hurt. She would sit by, sometimes smirking as if she found some dark amusement in my suffering. If anything, she seemed to revel in the chaos, as though it validated her disdain for me. Emily thrived in this environment. My sister, the golden child, the perfect daughter, remained untouched by the storm. She watched it all from her pedestal, occasionally tossing down her own barbs to make sure I stayed in my place. She wasn't just manipulative, she was calculating. She enjoyed seeing me squirm, knowing I was powerless to fight back. When our parents weren't looking, she would smirk at me, a silent reminder of her dominance. Sometimes, she'd go out of her way to provoke our father, setting me up to take the fall. Her lies were convincing, her crocodile tears perfectly timed. She was the angel, and I was the scapegoat. I'll never forget the day she crossed a line that cemented her as someone I couldn't trust. We were home alone after school, the house eerily quiet. I was at the kitchen table, desperately trying to finish my homework before our parents came home. I had learned the hard way that incomplete assignments would lead to more than just verbal reprimands. Emily called out to me from the living room, her voice sing-song and laced with mischief. Reluctantly, I went to see what she wanted. She was sitting on the couch, flipping through TV channels with an air of nonchalance. But her eyes betrayed her excitement. When I entered the room, she handed me a small box she'd pulled from under the couch. Her expression was unreadable as I opened it, and what I saw inside made my stomach churn. A dead bird lay in the box, its feathers stained with blood. It looked freshly killed. My hands trembled as I asked her where she'd found it. She just smiled, her expression calm yet unnervingly cold, and said she thought I might like it. When I tried to hand the box back to her, she refused to take it, insisting it was a gift. Then she leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. She threatened me, promising that if I told anyone, she would make sure our parents believed I had killed it. Terrified, I nodded and took the box to my room, unsure of what else to do. I hid the box under my bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was paranoid that my parents would find it and accuse me of something I hadn't done. The weight of that fear followed me everywhere, growing heavier each day. Emily, meanwhile, acted as if nothing had happened. She was a master of compartmentalization, able to transition seamlessly back into her role as the perfect daughter. I, however, was consumed by dread. That incident cemented my understanding of who Emily truly was, a cruel, twisted reflection of the person I had once admired. By the time I turned 12, the abuse had worn me down to the point where I could barely function. My father's beatings were no longer sporadic. They had become almost daily occurrences. My body was constantly sore, my mind a haze of fear and exhaustion. The emotional toll was even greater. Nightmares plagued me, vivid and relentless. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that my father was about to burst through my door. School, once a refuge of sorts, became unbearable. My grades plummeted, and I began getting into trouble for not paying attention or failing to complete assignments. Teachers chalked it up to laziness or a lack of discipline, never bothering to ask what was really going on. One night, after yet another beating, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face. The walls of my room, once a place of escape, felt like they were closing in. I couldn't take it anymore. The thought of enduring another day in that house, of living that life, was too much to bear. The idea of running away crossed my mind, but I knew there was nowhere to go. They'd find me, and the punishment would be worse than anything I could imagine. In my desperation, I decided there was only one way out. I went to the garage and found a length of rope. Back in my room, I tied it to the beam in my closet, my hands shaking with every knot. I climbed onto a chair, the rope around my neck, ready to step off and end it all. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, something inside me hesitated. It wasn't a grand epiphany or a sudden burst of hope. It was fear. The same fear that had kept me alive all those years stopped me from taking that final step. I didn't want to die. I just didn't want to live like that anymore. I untied the rope and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing until my body was too exhausted to produce any more tears. The next morning, I got up and went to school as if nothing had happened. On the outside, I was the same quiet, withdrawn kid I'd always been. But inside, I felt completely broken. I didn't know how to fix myself, and I wasn't sure I even wanted to try. All I knew was that something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, but I had no idea where to start or how to escape the nightmare that had become my life. By the time I turned 14, my life had become a bleak routine of fear and survival. The abuse at home was relentless, my father's drinking having escalated to a dangerous level. He was rarely sober, and when he wasn't passed out in his chair, he was finding new reasons to direct his fury at me. My mother remained cold and detached, her indifference as painful as his fists. Emily, still the golden child, thrived in the chaos, adding her own brand of torment to the mix. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, my spirit slowly eroding with each passing day. One night, everything changed. I was in my room, hunched over my homework, trying to focus despite the growing tension that seemed to radiate through the walls. My parents were arguing downstairs. Nothing new, but this time the yelling was louder, more charged. It sounded like they were tearing the house apart. Then came a loud crash, followed by a terrifying silence. My heart pounded in my chest as dread washed over me. Something about this fight was different, more dangerous. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I crept out of my room and down the stairs, careful to make as little noise as possible. When I reached the bottom, the scene in the living room stopped me cold. My father was lying on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and overturned furniture. My mother stood over him, holding the jagged neck of a broken bottle in her hand, her face twisted with fury. She was screaming at him to get up, but he didn't move. For a moment, I thought he was dead. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. When my mother turned and noticed me standing there, the look in her eyes chilled me to my core. It wasn't guilt or fear. It was hatred, pure and unfiltered. She stared at me for a long moment before dropping the bottle and walking out of the room, leaving me alone with my father's unconscious body. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear and indecision. Eventually, I forced myself to move, kneeling down beside him. He was still breathing, but it was shallow and labored. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave him there, to let him suffer for all the pain he'd caused me. But another part, the part that still clung to some shred of humanity, couldn't ignore his condition. In the end, I called 911 and told them what had happened. The paramedics arrived quickly, and they worked to stabilize my father before loading him onto a stretcher. My mother stood in the doorway, silent and expressionless, as they carried him out of the house. She didn't say a word to me, didn't acknowledge my presence. The weight of that night pressed heavily on me as I watched the ambulance disappear into the night. After that incident, everything shifted. My father spent several weeks in the hospital, recovering from his injuries and sobering up. When he finally returned home, he was a shell of the man he had been, quieter, subdued, and noticeably less inclined to drink. But the damage was already done. The years of abuse had carved scars too deep to heal, and I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. If I wanted to survive, I had to find a way out. That realization sparked something in me. For years, I had felt powerless, trapped by my circumstances. But now I saw a glimmer of hope, a way to take control of my life and escape the hellhole I had been born into. I threw myself into my schoolwork with a newfound determination, channeling all my anger and despair into something productive. Math became my refuge, a subject where logic and precision offered a sense of stability I desperately needed. As my grades improved, teachers began to take notice. One in particular, Mr. Thompson, became a pivotal figure in my life. He saw potential in me that no one else had ever bothered to acknowledge. He encouraged me to apply for scholarships, to aim higher than I'd ever thought possible. For the first time, I started to believe that I could build a future for myself, one that didn't involve my family. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, I had transformed from a struggling, invisible kid into one of the top students in my class. I maintained a 4.0 GPA and earned acceptance into a top university on a full scholarship. I chose to study finance, a field where I could use my math skills to create a successful career. My parents barely reacted to the news. My father was too consumed by his own shame and sobriety to care, while my mother remained distant and dismissive. Emily, as always, made sure to remind me that she was still the favorite, heading to a different university with my parents' full support. But I didn't care. I was leaving, and that was all that mattered. Moving out of that house felt like shedding a skin I had worn for too long. As I packed my things and prepared to leave for college, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. I was stepping into the unknown, but anything had to be better than the life I was leaving behind. For the first time, I had a chance to define myself on my own terms, free from the weight of my family's toxicity. At college, I worked harder than I ever had before. I spent countless hours in the library, poring over textbooks and working on assignments late into the night. My determination to succeed was fueled by a deep need to prove to myself that I was worth something, that I could rise above the circumstances of my past. The effort paid off. I excelled in my courses, earning top grades and securing internships that paved the way for a promising career. Despite my achievements, there was a lingering emptiness I couldn't quite shake. I had escaped my family, built a new life, and found success, but I still felt like something was missing. The shadows of my childhood clung to me, reminding me that no amount of success could fully erase the scars. Even now, as I look back on everything I've accomplished, I can't help but wonder what it would feel like to truly let go of the anger, the fear, and the pain. By the time I graduated college, I had achieved everything I had set out to do. I was at the top of my class, earning every accolade and opportunity that came my way. But despite my academic success, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something fundamental was missing. I had friends in college, but they remained on the periphery of my life. I couldn't let anyone get too close. The scars of my past had taught me to distrust others, to keep people at arm's length for fear of being hurt again. So, while others partied, dated, and formed lifelong bonds, I kept my head down, focused on my grades and the career I envisioned. My plan was simple: excel, build a life that would make my suffering worthwhile, and never look back. After graduating with honors, I landed a job at a promising finance company. It was everything I had worked for: a high-paying, prestigious position with opportunities to climb the corporate ladder. I threw myself into my work with the same relentless determination that had carried me through college. Long hours, extra projects, and perfectionism became my norm. My bosses noticed, and my efforts quickly paid off. Within a few years, I was promoted to a senior position, my salary doubling. I moved into a sleek apartment in the city, drove a car I had once dreamed about, and wore suits that exuded success. On paper, I was living the dream. But success came with a hollow realization. No matter how much I achieved or how far I climbed, the void inside me remained. My life had become a series of milestones, promotions, bonuses, accolades, all of which felt fleeting and superficial. I had cut off all contact with my family after leaving for college. I didn't call, didn't visit, didn't even send holiday cards. To me, they didn't exist anymore. But their absence left a hole I didn't know how to fill. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth, to myself and to some invisible judge, that I had never stopped to consider what I actually wanted. One night, that emptiness hit me harder than ever. I had just closed a major deal at work, one that promised a significant bonus and the admiration of my peers. I should have been elated. Instead, I came home to my pristine but lifeless apartment, sat on the couch, and stared at the wall. The silence was deafening. In that moment, it hit me. Despite everything I had accomplished, I was still that scared, lonely kid who just wanted someone to care. Tears welled up in my eyes as I grappled with the realization that success hadn't healed me. It had only masked my pain. For a fleeting moment, I considered reaching out to my family. Maybe, just maybe, they had changed. Maybe they missed me or regretted what they had done. But every time I picked up the phone, memories of their cruelty would resurface, paralyzing me. I couldn't forgive them for what they had done, and I wasn't sure I ever would. So I buried myself in work again, convincing myself that if I just achieved more, climbed higher, the void would eventually be filled. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. Success wasn't the answer. It was only a distraction. By the time I turned 28, I had everything I thought I wanted: a thriving career, financial stability, and independence. Yet, I felt more lost than ever. I had no close friends, no romantic relationships, and no sense of purpose beyond my job. Therapy had been a half-hearted attempt at first, something I dabbled in without fully committing. But after that night on the couch, I realized I couldn't keep going the way I was. I needed to face my demons, no matter how painful it might be. I found a new therapist, Dr. Evelyn Carter, who specialized in trauma and childhood abuse. From the moment I sat in her office, I felt a glimmer of hope. She created a space where I could confront the darkness inside me without fear of judgment. Therapy was grueling, forcing me to revisit memories I had buried deep. We talked about my parents, the abuse, the fear, and the anger that had defined so much of my life. Each session felt like peeling back another layer of myself, exposing wounds I didn't even know I had. Dr. Carter encouraged me to find something outside of work that brought me joy, a hobby or passion that wasn't tied to my past or my trauma. At first, I had no idea what that could be. My life had revolved around my career for so long that I didn't even know what I liked anymore. But after some trial and error, I discovered painting. I wasn't an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but there was something liberating about putting brush to canvas. It became a way to express emotions I couldn't put into words, a therapeutic outlet for the pain I had carried for so long. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself. Life began to feel a little more manageable. I wasn't just a successful financier with a traumatic past. I was Mike, the guy who liked to paint, who was trying to heal, who was learning to live for himself. It wasn't a perfect process and there were setbacks, but it was a start. Then, Out of nowhere, my world took an unexpected turn. One day, I received a letter from a law firm in London. The envelope was crisp and formal, and I almost dismissed it as junk mail. But something about it caught my attention. The letter informed me that I had been named the beneficiary in the will of someone named William Hargrave, a name I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a mistake or a scam. But as I read further, I realized it wasn't. The letter was legitimate. My heart raced as I tried to piece together who this man was and why he had included me in his will. The letter didn't provide many details, only that I was to receive a substantial inheritance. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Why would a stranger leave me anything, let alone what sounded like a significant sum of money? Questions swirled in my mind, but there were no immediate answers. I knew I had to follow up, to find out who William Hargrave was and why he had chosen me. Little did I know, that letter would set off a chain of events that would change my life forever. When I first received the letter about the inheritance, I dismissed it as a scam. The name William Hargrave didn't ring any bells, and the idea that someone I'd never met would leave me money seemed absurd. But as I read further, I realized this was real. The letter outlined an inheritance of $10 million, left to me by a man I didn't know. Stunned, I tried to process the news. Who was William Hargrave, and why would he leave me such an enormous amount of money? The letter provided no answers, only contact information for a London law firm and instructions on how to claim the inheritance. I was suspicious. How could I not be? $10 million was life-changing, and I wasn't about to take it blindly. I contacted the law firm, and after days of emails and phone calls, I was on a plane to London to meet with the lawyers in person. The trip felt surreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. My curiosity outweighed my apprehension as I tried to imagine who this man could be and why he had chosen me. When I arrived at the law firm, I was greeted by James Bradford, a lawyer with a no-nonsense demeanor and graying hair. He led me into a conference room, where he began to explain everything. William Hargrave, he said, had been a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune in real estate and investments. He had lived in London most of his life, never marrying or having children. By all accounts, he was a private man with few close relationships. Yet, in his will, he had named me as the sole beneficiary of his estate. The explanation only deepened my confusion. Why me? I had never heard of William Hargrave before. I couldn't think of any possible connection between us. That's when James Bradford dropped a bombshell that shattered my understanding of my own life. William Hargrave was my biological father. The words hung in the air, heavy and disorienting. My biological father? It felt impossible. I had never suspected I was adopted. My parents, Karen and Robert, had never given me any reason to doubt their claims of being my biological parents. But James produced documents that left no room for denial. Birth certificates, adoption papers, and legal records that trace my life back to William Hargrave. According to these documents, I had been born in London, and my biological mother had died shortly after giving birth. William, unable to care for me at the time, had arranged for Karen and Robert to adopt me. The condition of the adoption was that they never tell me the truth. I sat there, reeling from the revelation. My entire life had been a lie. I felt angry, betrayed, and deeply confused. Yet, amidst the chaos of emotions, there was also a strange sense of relief. Perhaps this explained why my parents had always treated me the way they did, why I had always felt like an outsider in my own family. Maybe, deep down, they had never truly seen me as their son. James handed me a letter from William. It was short, just a few lines, but it said everything I needed to know. William wrote that he had always regretted giving me up, but believed it was the best decision at the time. He had followed my life from a distance through updates from my adoptive parents, and he knew about the abuse and struggles I had faced. The inheritance, he said, was his way of making amends, of giving me the life he had always hoped I would have. I left the law firm in a daze, wandering the streets of London with no destination in mind. My entire life had been upended, and I didn't know how to process it. But one thing was clear: I needed answers from the people who had raised me. I needed to confront Karen and Robert. When I returned to the States, I made the decision to visit them. Driving up to the house I had once called home, I was filled with a mix of anger and dread. The house looked the same, but I felt like a stranger as I walked up to the front door. My mother answered, her expression shifting from shock to guarded suspicion. My father sat on the couch, a beer in hand, while Emily lounged nearby, scrolling through her phone. The room fell silent as I stepped inside. I wasted no time. I told them everything I had learned in London about William Hargrave, the adoption, and the inheritance. My mother's face went pale, and my father's expression hardened. Emily looked up from her phone, her face a mask of disbelief. The room buzzed with tension as they tried to process the revelation. Finally, my father broke the silence. He demanded to know how much money I had inherited. His tone was aggressive, and his questions relentless. My mother stayed quiet, but I could see the greed flickering in her eyes. They didn't care about the truth or about the lies they had told me my entire life. All they cared about was the money. When I told them it was $10 million, my father's demeanor shifted from anger to entitlement. He demanded that I give them $1 million, claiming it was the least I could do after everything they had done for me. The audacity of his words stunned me. After years of abuse and neglect, they thought they deserved a reward? I refused, telling them they didn't deserve a single penny. My father's face twisted with rage. He stood up, his fists clenched, while my mother began to cry, playing the victim. Emily, ever the manipulative one, simply smirked, her expression cold and calculating. The hatred in their eyes was palpable, and I knew they would never let this go. I left the house, slamming the door behind me, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. As I walked to my car, I heard footsteps behind me. Before I could turn, I felt a sharp pain in my side. Emily had struck me with a folding stick, and the pain was excruciating. I fell to the ground as my father joined in, kicking me and screaming insults. I tried to protect myself, but their attack was relentless. Emily kept hitting me, and I could feel my ribs crack under the blows. I thought they were going to kill me. Somehow, I managed to crawl to my car and drive to the hospital. The pain was blinding, but adrenaline kept me moving. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed me with multiple broken ribs and internal bleeding. I underwent surgery and spent several days recovering. While in the hospital, I contacted a lawyer, Becca Price. She was sharp, relentless, and specialized in family violence cases. I told her everything, and she helped me file assault charges against my parents and Emily. The legal battle was grueling. They tried to paint me as the aggressor, but Becca gathered undeniable evidence, including medical records and witness statements from hospital staff. In the end, my father and Emily were convicted and sentenced to prison. It wasn't as long as I'd hoped, but it was enough to ensure they could never hurt me again. Now, I'm trying to rebuild my life. I've inherited a fortune but lost what little family I had left. I'm still in therapy, working with Dr. Carter to process the trauma of the attack and the revelations about my adoption. I've started painting again, finding solace in the creative outlet that helped me begin to heal. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm determined to keep moving forward. My life has been filled with pain and loss, but I've survived. Now, I need to learn how to truly live, to find peace and happiness despite everything I've endured. For the first time, I feel like that might actually be possible.